That was some introduction, Nick. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here and so happy to see so many of you in the evening too, who are willing to hear about causality. That's a great pleasure. I will share my screen for you, and then I PowerPoint slideshow, share. I hope it works. Does it work?
Yeah.
Great. So what I am going to talk about here is based on a project and collaboration with a nice little mixture of philosophers and psychologists. These are Rani Lill Anjum, she's a philosopher and associate professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and the leader of CAPS, Center for Applied Philosophy of Science. And she is one of the brains, together with Stephen Mumford, behind the dispositional theory on causation that I will talk about here today. And we've got Tobias Gustum Lindstad working as a clinical psychologist and also collaborating with or connected to this CAPS Center for Philosophy of Science. And Margrethe Seger Halvorsen, Erik Stenneke, and I myself, we are all clinical psychologists and working as associate professors at the Department of Psychology, University of Oslo. And Erik Stenneke, he's also a philosopher, besides being a clinical psychologist. So we are working together trying to examine the question of causality in psychotherapy research and how evidential pluralism would look like in clinical research and practice. I would also like to include Professor John MacLeod in this. I assume he's known to most of you. Before he retired, he was together with us at the University of Oslo for several years, and through discussions and seminars, he formed a major part of this developing interest in the question of causality. Where Professor Rolf Sunde at the University of Southeastern Norway also took part. So these are important colleagues in all this. So why should we bother about the question of causality? I would just like to start with a quote by Bertrand Russell from back in 1912, 1913, who, according to George Henrik von Wright, wrote in his essay on the notion of cause, all philosophers of every school imagine that causation is one of the fundamental axioms or postulates of science. Yet, oddly enough, in advanced sciences such as gravitational astronomy, the word cause never occurs. The law of causality, I believe, like must that passes muster among philosophers, a relic of a bygone age, surviving, like the monarchy, only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. And that is what we usually say in Norway too. Why bother to get rid of the monarchy? They do not harm anyone after all, so we continue having them. Anyway, unlike with the monarchy, I have turned out to favor causality after not really being so bothered by the whole question. I have usually stuck to the traditional Diltheian distinction between explanations and understanding, which I will get back to in a short while. Now, however, I think there are two reasons why we should bother with causation. First, journal editors and reviewers may want us to, not necessarily intentionally, I think, but the call for causality often seems to be there as a fundamental premise for their requests of methodological rigor. This was one of the reasons why the whole question of causality captured my attention at a certain point. I began to reflect upon this seeming call. I don't know exactly from where, journal editors perhaps, or maybe just as well from colleagues who had their manuscripts rejected from certain journals. So the argument goes, they, the high-ranking journals within psychotherapy research, only want analysis conducted by multi-level modeling, that is complex regression analysis. Besides, correlational designs are obviously unwarranted because they put such serious limitations on what you can actually say about your findings and so on. Those really interesting questions are left unanswered. Also, frequently there's a request for control groups, even though it might not be in accordance with the particular design and aims of your study. So I was thinking, what is this all about? Is it perhaps a sound voice in there, a voice or a wish that I myself would agree with? And yes, put very briefly, I think so. If this call for complex multi-level modeling, for example, primarily reflects a wish to identify complex processes and how incidents actually interact, work, or play together. Perhaps this is the case rather than a wish for fancy statistical designs per se, which is also an understandable and even decent wish as long as it does not restrain the freedom of the rest of the research field, of course. So obviously this movement towards gradually more sophisticated statistical designs basically reflects a deep wish to acquire more nuanced knowledge about complex processes. And I'm willing to embrace that, of course, in itself. But then the question arises, do we necessarily need to use these particular designs and methods to gain or develop knowledge about causal processes? And how suited are these particular methods after all? So if we accept that this call for those particular methods reflect a yearning for causal explanations, we will need to re-inspect the non-articulated, taken for granted supposition that only experimental designs and particular statistical methods may provide those explanations. And we would need to consider if these designs in themselves provide sufficient evidence on causality. We will get back to what these experimental designs actually presuppose, the logic of experiments, such as, for example, the RCTs. For now, let us just accept the premise that causal relationships are interesting, whichever way we understand them. They have concerned philosophers at all times. We tend to organize events in causal relationships. They seem to be fundamental to us. A second reason to bother with causality and related to this implicit, fundamental, ontologically based call for causality is that policymakers want us to, or at least we think they do, and so we are getting used to argue in line with an expectation of causality. People, policymakers, and various committees and councils who are given the responsibility for developing guidelines and criteria for sound practice will obviously ask for the effects of what we do. And it goes with the social contract that we are able to ensure people that therapy works and to convey that in a way that is actually conceivable, understandable. Thus, people and policymakers need access to a language and conceptualisations of science, including causality, that reflects the field of our findings and practice in a valid way. And so we're zooming into the debate on evidence-based practices, which I assume is well known to most of you. And I assume that you've also got your discussions that reflect your particular situation in mental health services in UK, like we have had in Norway, where the Norwegian Psychological Association adhered to the American Psychological Association, APA's policy statement on evidence-based practice back in 2005. The debate leading up to and following that particular policy statement in 2005 touches upon the fundamental question of causality, although causality itself is rarely addressed. And I will try to lead you through this reasoning. The definition of evidence-based practice goes like this. It's my underlining. Evidence-based practice in psychology is the integration of the best available research with clinical practice in the context of patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. May also be visualized like this. This is a major contribution and development from the preceding APA Division 12 Task Force on Promotion and Dissemination of Psychological Procedures, which sparked massive critique for its unilateral trust in RCTs as a proper source of evidence. This new task force, resulting in this 2005 policy statement, reflects the marked turn in favor of multiple research designs and emphasis on clinical utility. The way had shifted from a sole emphasis on evidence-based methods to evidence-based practice. This shift may be understood in light of decades of research demonstrating a somewhat more complex picture of results than clear relationships between treatment outcome and use of specific methods or interventions on specific diagnoses or conditions. Just a very brief summary of some highlights of findings. I guess these are maybe known to most of you. Therapy is indeed effective, demonstrated through hosts of studies and meta-analysis during the past 50 to 60 years of psychotherapy research. Equally true, about 400 to 500 therapy approaches models are equally effective. That is no comparative, there are no comparative effects between them overall. Common factors are robust predictors of outcome, These are the alliance, therapist contribution, client contribution, general therapeutic change principles, principles of change such as motivation, exposure, etc. And this has made researchers aware of those crucial factors that seemingly work across the particular clinical theories and models, causing a shift toward increased focus on processes as well as therapist and client contributions. So while previous research was directed at demonstrating specific and comparative effects of single models or interventions, much of clinical research has shifted towards an increased focus on process analysis and process outcome studies rather than primarily experimental design such as RCTs. The question then is, how does therapy work? What happens during therapy? What are the mechanisms in all their complexities? In this picture, we witness other research designs becoming increasingly important, such as, for example, qualitative process analysis, including case studies and all their variants. Very much as a response to these robust and stable findings from the research, there were heated debates within the field from the mid-90s to the beginning of 2000 about what should count as evidence, and the gold standard and the experimental or RCT design was highly challenged. The research field called for a more including, pluralistic approach to research to be able to develop relevant knowledge about psychotherapy and how it works. And that was the backdrop of the revised Declaration of Evidence-Based Practice, the APA policy statement of 2005. And this policy statement implies a serious recognition of complexity and local, non-standardized decisions on the part of the professional. And besides emphasizing psychotherapy as a contextually based activity, the report and policy statement explicitly highlighted the value of basing evidence on multiple research designs applied for each their purposes, and not only for RCTs. And these included, as you could see, the whole list here. So we are witnessing a sound, generous embracement of the various knowledge sources here and the potential contributions of different perspectives on the research situation and the questions to be answered. However, despite this opening up, which was caused by years of research and solid debates on proper scientific criteria, there is still one remnant from the past in this policy statement on evidence-based practice. Causality is still exclusively associated with RCTs, as RCTs and their logical equivalents, efficacy research, are the standard for drawing causal inferences about the effects of interventions. Correspondingly, types of evidence are ranked according to their contribution to conclusions about efficacy with sophisticated empirical methodologies, including quasi-experiments and randomized control experiments or their logical equivalents on top, followed by the clarification that RCTs represent a more stringent way to evaluate treatment efficacy because they are the most effective way to rule out threats to internal validity in a single experiment. Thus, RCTs and their equivalents still figures as most fit to establish causality, and the argument is based on the aim of ensuring internal validity. And this rank ordering is of great importance for how we evaluate the fitness or accuracy of our research designs and methods as to scientific rigor. Moreover, this take on causality has serious implications for the evaluation of the generalizability of our findings. This is because causality, as it is understood within experimental tradition, draws on empiricism and later on positivism and the Humean regularity conception of causality, which with its own implications for generalizability. Let us first look at this conception of causality. David Hume and his famous work, A Treatise of Human Nature from 1739, has been highly influential for how we conceptualize causality within philosophy and science. Hume used the example of the billiard ball table. Here, hitting the object ball with a cue ball causes the object ball to roll. But what are we actually up what do we actually observe on the table? Hume found 3 observable features of causality. The cause is perfectly correlated with its effect, so that every time the cause happens, the effect follows. He called that the constant conjunction of cause and effect. The cause always happens before the effect. He called this temporal priority. There must be some contact between cause and effect in time and space so that the cause and effect meet. He called this contiguity. Hume thus established 4 criteria for causation. If an observational study can demonstrate that the cause always precedes the effect is temporarily close to the cause, the association is repeatedly and constantly observed. And the underlying implication is causation in itself is not observable. It is only the regularity of one event being followed by another that is observable. Outside of regularities, there is no point in looking for causes. No identification of causal mechanisms beyond the observable is warranted. As such, it is in reality an anti-causation theory, which still thrives well within modern sciences. The contours of the scientific landscape are clear. Empiricism and positivism share some fundamental ideas of scientific knowledge that still prevail across disciplines. I think we all recognize the strict demand of not claiming causality in our research. One of the things we learn as we enter academia is to be highly modest about causality. We learn that claiming correlations might be warranted, or we might learn that we can just as well skip the whole question of causality and instead talk about understanding if we want to deal with complex contextualized phenomena, such as is often the case with human beings and their relationships and social systems. And we will get back to that. Let us now look at the premises of empiricism and the implications of that. Hempel, he postulated the function of general laws and the symmetry between explanation and prediction. Hempel's covering law and the symmetry between explanation and prediction imply that to explain a phenomenon is to demonstrate empirically that it is an instance of a general law. These premises are crucial to understand the criteria of random sampling and of generalizability within modern sciences. These ideas reflect the premise of universalism. There is an inherent orderliness or regularity in nature, universal laws, which in turn enables trustworthy predictions insofar as we have conducted careful observations of how the instances or phenomena in question are related to each other. This is the bearing premise of generalizations based on random sampling. If we have observed a pattern in a sample that properly represents a larger population, the prevailing idea is that we have reasons to expect the same pattern unfolding in that population. The observations, however, must be conducted under certain conditions to ensure proper control over dependent and independent variables. The experiments, such as randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are one such condition and have come to represent the gold standard of rigorous knowledge production within clinical research. Causal modeling in terms of complex regression analysis or multi-level modeling are examples of scientific methods that follow the same premises. Moreover, clearly operationalized concepts or variables are crucial to avoid any confusion of what phenomena we are dealing with, and hence knowledge is formulated as statements or propositions, as opposed to know-how, tacit knowledge, implicit reasoning, etc. Aggregation through repeated measures and or large samples is still another criterion to minimize the influence of local contextual factors that confuse a stable pattern of findings and thus ensures the reliability of findings. In sum, observations of particular relations between variables conducted under certain conditions ensure identification of events or phenomena that are of general value, We need not worry about defining scope of application if only these conditions are met. In principle, generalizations are ensured beforehand. These premises reflect the zeitgeist of academia during the Enlightenment from the 17th century and are perhaps most often referred to in terms of positivism, which seems to have turned into a metaphor of the zeitgeist as a whole. Causality, the crux of explanation and knowledge production, are thus indebted to demonstrations of regularities only, free of context, values, or theoretical assumptions of causal mechanisms and purposiveness. Facing the empiricist demands and the prominent status of the adjacent experimental designs, one stance to the question of causality has been to lean on a Dilthean distinction between explanations and understanding as two pervasively different modes of knowing. While reserving explanations for experimental designs that provide knowledge about dependent, including causal relationships between definite variables, understanding has been associated with qualitative, contextualized knowledge developed from language-based, interpretative, hermeneutic-oriented approaches. The argument goes that understanding captures the complex, intricate relationships between incidents and experiences that may not fit in with an approach whose aim is to establish clearly observable causal relationships between definite variables. And in line with this, one would happily dismiss the claim of causality as punctuating a sequence of acts in the way proclaimed by the regularity model would hamper access to complex relationships and thereby violate the phenomena themselves. While a dismissive stance to causality is coherent with interpretative disciplines and various perspectives under the umbrella of phenomenology, post-structuralism, and postmodernism, others have challenged the status of the Humean regularity model by discussing and elaborating on the causality conception itself, such as witnessed within various realist perspectives. For example, Maxwell, he draws on critical realism in his endorsement of causality, arguing that qualitative research is particularly fit for causal explanations. Addressing the situation within education research as reflected in the National Research Council's report on scientific research in education, Maxwell challenges the trust in the regularity model and its variable-oriented approach that he finds narrow and philosophically outdated. Rather than focusing on observable contingencies, critical realism advocates identification of causal relationships at the level of generative mechanisms, addressing the question of how something came about, including the complex dynamics of social objects and relations, as well as intentions, beliefs, and meaning. Accordingly, to ensure valid causal explanations, these mechanisms should form part of scientific analysis. Also arguing from a realist perspective, Angus Deaton and Nancy Cartwright, as a philosopher, put forward a critique of what they observe as an undue trust in RCTs in social sciences, as well as within medicine. Through rigorous examination of the properties of RCTs, they question the usefulness of causal relationships established by these designs. One of the main arguments is that they have limited predictive value as long as they are separated from what they call support factors, which are responsible for the differing manifestations of effects across situations. Moreover, and accordingly, the extrapolation or generalization of causal relationships hinge on prior knowledge in terms of various methods and theory within a cumulative program, which altogether help us understand not only what works as established within experimental conditions, but why things work, they argue. Thus, an overall message from these proponents of realist perspectives is that we cannot get to the core of causal explanations without studying phenomena as they appear in contexts that are constitutive of the phenomena themselves. Hence, from the perspective of realism, we do not need to relegate context-dependent, process-oriented approaches to argue for causal explanations. Deaton and Cartwright highlight the need of a breadth of knowledge sources to develop robust causal knowledge. These are arguments we will pursue and elaborate on by use of the perspective of causal, dispositionalism, and the evidential pluralism derived from it. Like the perspectives of realism, a dispositional view of causation advocates process-oriented, complex understandings of the mechanisms of causality. Picking up on Aristotle and the ancient tradition, the Anjum-Mumford dispositionalist theory emphasizes the intrinsic causal powers of systems, thus shifting attention from identifying law-like regularities to understanding the intrinsic dispositions and causal capacities allowing such regularities. Dispositionalism is an ontology of causality. The core idea of dispositional ontology is that real causal powers exist and they can contribute or counteract certain effects. Moreover, causation is a primitive and singular matter and cannot be reduced to non-causal facts such as regularity or counterfactual dependence. Powers or dispositions belong to a particular thing, individual, process, communities, or social systems. Powers thus span from the very concrete to higher level abstract entities. Causes tend or dispose towards effects and does not necessitate effects. And causation involves tendencies towards an outcome rather than the guarantee of an outcome. An effect is a result of sufficient interaction between mutual causal partners. As opposed to the Humean conception of regularity, dispositionalists would not link causation to perfect regularities, but to tendencies. In this view, a cause is something that tends towards its effect with stronger or weaker intensity. They, the dispositions or powers, are causal potentials. And powers dispositions might be unmanifested. To operate as causes, powers are dependent on actualizing factors, or what they call manifestation partners, which resemble what is also often referred to as, for example, support factors, interactive variables, or moderators. Unlike what these notions refer to, however, manifestation partners are not to be understood as mere conditions for the real cause to work. For example, the working alliance in therapy is not a background condition for the theory-specific intervention to do its causal work. Rather, it is itself part of the causal process, together with all the other factors that accounts for the outcome. Causality thus exists in a unique web of interacting dispositions, working as manifestation partners towards the emerging results. As is expressed by Stephen Mumford, different powers work with each other or sometimes against each other to produce the history of events. Various powers should then each add their effect to produce a larger combined effect. Unlike with the regularity model, there is no temporal priority involved, rather a dynamic of symmetric, reciprocal relations between properties simultaneously interacting on each other. Hence, causation neither refers to pure observable contingencies nor some separate underlying driver, but applies to the whole process of interacting dispositions or powers that altogether are responsible for some particular effect. Thus, causal complexity is characteristic of dispositional ontology. Dispositional causal theory addresses complex causal mechanisms, of which some are not observable and not yet manifested. The connection between powers and their manifestations has been subject of debate between advocates of the Humean perspective and those who propose powers as causal drivers, such as Mumford, for example. One suggestion from the Humeans is to understand dispositions in terms of counterfactual conditionals, that is, something that is not empirically demonstrated, but could just as well be true as kind of a hypothesis, and then operationalize them into observable variables that could be tested. The problem, though, from the powers perspective, is that such translations are not possible. That's what Mumford would argue. And here we are touching upon the challenges of operationalizations. How do we, for example, operationalize tacit knowledge, implicit reasoning, unconscious intentions, conflicting motives, or other forms of information processing that may contribute considerably to behavior or any other effect? And how do we operationalize the often subtle contextual factors? Obviously, all kinds of data and findings must be expressed in some form that is operationalized. The question, however, is what form suits best. One way is following the ideals of empiricism and positivism to disentangle behaviors in terms of discrete entities or markers that are easily agreed upon as representing the phenomenon in question and that are easily observable, like we would do with experimental conditions and RCTs. A classic concern would, however, be that we then may lose the context that is part of the phenomenon itself. We recognize these discussions and struggles, which seemingly have been bothering research at all times. And there are various ways to try and solve these dilemmas. One obvious example would be the qualitative methods, but complexities are not reserved for those methods alone, of course. So these discussions and questions are well known. The question is, however, whether phenomena that are not so easily operationalized in terms of discrete entities may also take part in the web of causality. Or would we need to, in line with the APA policy statement, restrict ourselves to admit that these are indeed interesting phenomena which may inform the field and clinical practice, but which may not count as causes? Might, for example, unconscious processes that may lack definite manifestations be accepted as a cause? What about delayed effects? For example, non-articulated processes and insights that develop and manifest themselves after several hours, days, months, or even years after the particular intervention. We do know about these processes as clinicians. May these also count as causes, take part in the complex picture of causal powers and manifestation partners? If so, we will need to expand our research focus and include also other research methods as potentially contributors to identifying causality. A key word here is variation. We might need various perspectives to ensure a complete picture of relevant powers and manifestation partners. The ontology of dispositionalism emphasizes or is focused on the complex and unique interplay of powers and manifestation partners and might be associated with single case studies. The dispositional ontology is, however, not at odds with identifying causality also in larger groups, or the aim of getting a more general picture of causal relationships of a particular phenomenon. One of the implications of the emphasis on complexity and unique variations is that we do need aggregated data to be able to establish robust knowledge on causal relationships. And all sorts of research designs and methods may contribute valuably to get to an aggregated picture of causality of a particular phenomenon. To be able to identify a pattern of causality that is interesting and relevant, we need aggregated knowledge based on sufficient variation or sufficiently varied sources of knowledge. And now this is a horrible slide, I know. It is just to give you a picture of how various research methods may contribute to identifying causal dispositions and manifestation partners, and with corresponding recommendations. This table is developed by Elena Rocca and Rani Anjum in an article from 2020. There analysis demonstrates the necessity of combining the various methods and to let them play different roles at different stages during the research process, according to their particular strengths and limitations. And if we return to our situation within the field of psychotherapy research, decades of research has revealed a complex picture of findings that are not easy to understand by knowledge derived from RCTs alone. So to make sense of the often counterintuitive findings, such as lack of comparative effects and specific effects of specific techniques, we need various sources of knowledge, such as process analysis, and not the least theorizing, just to mention a few relevant sources of knowledge. I think other perspectives on causation, other conceptualisations, such as that of dispositionalism, open to new complementary criteria of scientific rigor. For example, this view is very much compatible with a view of generalizability through theory and concept development. That is a processual transfer of knowledge based on readers' increased, elaborated, revised understanding of a phenomenon. Thus, one of the implications of a dispositional ontology, which I find appealing, is that it implies theorizing or theory development as a crucial part of scientific activity. As follows from the dispositional view or ontology with its search for causal explanations in terms of propensities, tendencies, rather than observable regularity, constant conjunctions, we will need to go beyond data. To create space for theorizing, for hypothesis, it is a crucial part of science. If, however, that is to happen, we need observations of the complexities, the unique variations across situations or contexts, and we need a certain abstraction level that allows the theoretical wrestling or abductions needed to identify and to develop some kind of understanding of patterns within and across these variations, which obviously moves beyond a billiard ball conception of relationships. Theorizing as a means to knowledge transfer and generalizations is also well described by Bill Stiles in several of his publications, which you may look up if you like. Those of you who are familiar with qualitative research will recognize this developed understanding in terms of conceptual or theory development as a crucial means to knowledge transfer and generalizability of findings. Generalizability is ensured not in terms of the symmetry of explanation and prediction, where findings apply to a particular population because of random sampling due to the principle of universalism and general laws. Rather, the relevance of your findings are considered by the audience, for example, in terms of elaborated or deepened understanding of a phenomenon, and often is a processual activity. Okay, finally, let us turn to evidential pluralism, which is one way of recognizing and appreciating the benefits of variation. If we recognize the need of articulating and claiming causality, while at the same time recognize the limits of any design, including experimental designs and mediation analysis, a valid approach to the intricate networks of human and social phenomena is to critically evaluate the capacities for causal explanations of all designs. And for that to be a fair practice, treating all designs on their own premises, we will need to transcend the perspective of empiricism. Speaking from the philosophy of pluralism, one would assert that as the premises on which evaluations are based differ so fundamentally between the various systems of belief, value, and action, spanning from religion to reason to communication, etc., any attempt at consensus on truth or valid evaluations of truth is utopian. Rather than aiming for ideal conditions of harmony, one would take a pragmatic position, recognizing the unique viability of each system and arrangement, not because any of them are ideal, but because there is no alternative stance without undue conflicts and power struggles. As to managing complexity and imperfection, rather than striving for consensus, one would, according to Rescher, strive to make the world safe for disagreement. And adopting the same approach to the methodological plurality within psychotherapy research, We would not only advocate the unique contribution of each design and method, but refrain from any attempt at ascribing particular status to one specific design, and rather highlight the necessity of various methods with each their capacities for identifying dispositions or causal powers. So, as to research, we need aggregated knowledge to establish causality, to complement a robust picture of causal relationships with a particular phenomenon. That aggregation involves use of multiple sources of knowledge, such as empirical findings from various research designs and angles, and rigorous theoretical and conceptual argumentations. Theory building and concept development is one such means to generalizability. And if you are conducting qualitative research or any other research that does not fall into the category of experimental designs, please do not, as a default mechanism, excuse the validity of your findings nor the generalizability. We all want our results to apply beyond the particular research setting, otherwise there would be no use in doing research. And professionals, for example, as counselors, as psychologists within the disciplines of social sciences have got lots of cases themselves on their repertoire. They do not need us to give them, as researchers, to give them just another one. They need some form of synthesized knowledge. And these syntheses should be performed rigorously following some strict rules. However, the rules vary according to the particular aims and research questions. We should make sure we are aware of and argue in line with the particular criteria for performing and ensuring quality within our particular kind of research. And as to clinicians, as we all know, and in line with a dispositional perspective, to be able to help this particular person in their particular situation and circumstances, we need to know the local unique factors that work together towards and against particular effects or directions. This is what sophisticated case formulations are about. So in one way, the most crucial causal relationships are identified locally. And for that to happen in an informed and wise way, the clinician, need an elaborate repertoire of knowledge at all levels, not just results from any RCTs, of course, and not just from any surveys, and not just from qualitative analysis. We need plurality tailored to the unique case, and that is what sound decision-making is about. I think I will stop there.